Welcome one and all to Peace Action Manhattan and Peace Action New York State Forum. We have a monthly forum on the first Thursday of every month here, and we're happy to see all of you. We have a very exciting program for tonight, and we're happy all of you have come to join us. If you would like to join Peace Action Manhattan, we'd love to welcome you into our ranks. We're an active local peace group, so we'll follow up with you if you've signed up at the door. If you haven't signed up at the door, please do clearly write your name and email address and your phone number. If you'd like, we'll contact you and tell you about our further events. I'm going to hand the microphone over to my friend and colleague Sally Jones from New York Peace Action New York State to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Florindo. The reason why we're holding this little thing is we're recording tonight, so I just want to let you know that. And it doesn't broadcast out to help you hear, but it will make the recording so much better, so we're going to pass it around as we use it. So my name is Sally Jones. I'm the chair of Peace Action Fund of New York State, and we've been collaborating with Peace Action Manhattan on these every first Thursday sort of forums or workshops or events. And this is our first one after the summer, so we did, it was a little bit hard to get the word out. You all came out basically in a week of work, and I want to thank the people here who helped get the word out. Ann Bowers, Karen Steele, Deborah Taylor, Florindo, Sylvia, and Sane, who's on the video. So thank you all, and I probably forgot, but thank you for getting the word out. So as you all know, there was a big uproar in August when two of our congressional representatives could not get into Israel because of their outspokenness on Israeli policies. And the BDS movement got some publicity as a result. The boycott, divestment, and sanction movement. That's why we're here to hear about, what this means, the fact that there was this big controversy, and where do we go from here? Whether you support the BDS movement or not, you are welcome here. This is, this is an open discussion, and, we want, I know that Florindo and I are, just want you to feel comfortable in asking your questions and being open-minded. Okay, so I get the fun job of introducing our speakers, and we have two wonderful speakers. I know the first speaker, RIHAN BARGOUTI, because she came to Staten Island 4 years ago when Peace Action of Staten Island was interested in the BDS movement, and they ended up endorsing it after she and her colleague from ADALAH, New York made a presentation. We had a lot of discussions, and it was endorsed by the membership in a serious vote that we did over a couple of, a few months. So RIHAN, she was born in the United States, but she lived quite a while in Palestine. She is a dancer. When she was in Palestine, she worked at the United Nations Development Program and other non-governmental organizations, and at Birzeit University. She's also a dancer. She teaches dance, and she's involved in teaching at a school in Brooklyn right now. She was a dancer and choreographer with El-Funoun, the Palestinian Popular Dance Troupe. In 2004, she helped launch the Palestinian Campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. So you will get to hear her. And also Jenny. Jenny Newman, I just met tonight, but we talked on the phone. She was recommended through our friends in Jewish Voices for Peace. She helped found a chapter of Jewish Voices for Peace at her campus, NYU, and was part of a very interesting effort to get the NYU student body or student organization to support the BDS movement, along with the Students for Justice in Palestine. She has lived in Israel and has done volunteer work in Palestine on the West Bank, I believe, and she's worked with an Israeli human rights lawyer. She will tell you more about this. So the way we're going to work it is each speaker is going to talk about 15 minutes, 10 or 15 minutes, whatever you're comfortable with. I'll if you go over, we'll give you a little sign. And then we want to do Q&A and have a discussion and get your questions out there and give everyone a chance to get some answers. So I am going to pass this first to RIHAN.
Well, thank you, Peace Action Manhattan, Peace Action New York State, for inviting me to speak with you and to be with you tonight. I want to take a step back from the political moment that Sally talked about and kind of try to provide a little bit of an overview about how maybe we got to this point and what are some of the challenges that we're still seeing and facing. I believe in the United States there's a very clear political divide currently, and some people might say that it's Democrats versus Republicans, but I think that most of us understand that it's much deeper than that. There's a split between a political and economic elite that is benefiting and has benefited from maintaining certain socioeconomic and political structures in this country that have kept them in power, and those that are working to kind of challenge those very structures. What's different in this political moment, I believe, is the positioning of the Palestinian struggle, which maybe for the first time clearly lies with the latter category of those social justice campaigns, and is talked about alongside immigrant rights and labor rights and Black Lives Matter and indigenous people, LGBTQ struggles, while the pro-Israeli lobby in the US has appropriately aligned itself with white supremacist, white nationalist, largely anti-Semitic, strangely enough, forces in the United States. And I think that that's a very important development in the current political situation in the United States. So I believe one of the factors that led us here is the highly ethical and principled call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions that came out of Palestine in 2005. So at that point, Palestinians on the ground living in the occupied territories, but also aligned with Palestinians living in the 48 territories, refugees in Lebanon, in Jordan, came together, over 170 civil society organizations, and issued this call for people of conscience around the world to carry out boycott and divestments and sanctions against Israel with three major demands. Israel end the occupation, treat all its Palestinian citizens as equals, and implement the Palestinian refugees' UN-sanctioned right to return to their homes and lands. BDS was presented as the most effective way individuals around the world could stand in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for liberation, while there were many other ways, humanitarian assistance, awareness raising, but this was a way to actually carry out actionable activities in support of this and be vocal about the support, not just through your voices, but through money, which we know means a lot in the United States. So individuals, community organizations, faith-based groups, unions, student and academic organizations, really around the world, from Europe to Asia, Africa, the United States, South America, in Canada, responded quite strongly to this call with a wide range of very context-specific creative campaigns targeting Israeli economic institutions, international economic institutions, companies, as well as Israeli academic and cultural and sports institutions. Now, the strongest argument that I've ever heard made against the BDS movement, and there aren't many, they can't formulate a really strong argument against it, but it's that it's going to mean the end of Israel, right? That's the big, scary thing. And it begs the question that if the implementation of democracy and equality and human rights entails the end of the state of Israel, then what does that say about the current state of Israel? And is that something that we do want to align and maintain, if this is what it takes to break it? In the United States, there has been years of organizing on the grassroots level here. I look forward to hearing more from Jenny about the campaigns that she's worked on. I can talk a little bit during the Q&A about the ADALAH-NY campaigns. But there's been, since 2005, when I returned from Palestine, work that's been done on the ground that has kind of shifted the discourse on Palestine and Palestinian rights, where organizations have moved, and including those organizations that we value, who, sponsorship and partnerships we value the most, have actually shifted their discourse beyond, or their activism, beyond just a call for an end to the occupation, and really adopting the full demands of the Palestinian people, which, as I said, is an end to the occupation, equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel, and the right of refugees to return. Years of conscientious development and work within Jewish Voice for Peace entailed the organization's movement from a stance in support of the boycott, for example, of just settlement goods, to the groups signing on to the full BDS call, and most recently adopting a very strong anti-Zionism platform. Anti-war groups such as the Peace Action, or what Peace Action formerly was, that did not really want to deal with the issue of Palestine. When I came in 2005 and I went to talk to certain organizations, and they're like, it's divisive, let's focus on Afghanistan, let's focus on Iraq, we don't want to touch Palestine, it's going to ruin the movement, right? These groups have come to the forefront of kind of engaging and carrying out BDS campaigns, including such organizations as Code Pink, Brooklyn for Peace, Peace Action, Staten Island, as Sally said, adopting the BDS resolution. So we can see the shift that's happened within that generally progressive left anti-war movement. And notably also, the largest national coalition of Palestinian solidarity organizations in the United States actually changed its name from the U.S. Campaign to End the Occupation, a very specific call, to the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, kind of reflecting the change in the organization's focus and belief in the full menu of Palestinian rights, not just an end of the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but the three demands of the Palestinian call for BDS. All of this within the Palestinian struggle was very, very important. It was coupled with the establishment and growth of professional Palestinian organizations, or pro-Palestinian organizations, that have been established during the past 10 to 15 years, I would say mainly by young, very dedicated, educated, and civic-minded Palestinian Americans that embraced both the principles of the struggle for Palestinian liberation and all that that would entail, and the tenets of democracy and freedom that they learned in their education and their upbringing in the United States. And that has led to organizations like the Institute for Middle East Understanding, which has done an amazing job of bringing the Palestinian narrative into U.S. Mainstream media. Palestine Legal, that has provided invaluable information and legal support for Palestinians and Palestinian solidarity activists that have come under attack for their political views in the United States. So the work of Palestinian solidarity organizations, in addition to the establishment of like professional Palestinian or pro-Palestinian organizations in the United States, has brought Palestine really to the forefront and into the mainstream, and whether it be in media, whether it be in terms of where the discussion is taking place and the individuals that are happening. Just as importantly as that has been the cross-struggle solidarity that Palestinian members of and members of other social justice movements here in the U.S. have displayed. So if we look at the acts of solidarity that took place from 2014 between activists in Ferguson and activists in the Gaza Strip, kind of sharing solidarity while those two communities were being attacked, and understanding that it was the same tear gas that was being used in Ferguson as was being used in Gaza. This solidarity continued to grow through different joint actions. There was a really good short segment in 2015 put out, When I See Them, I See Us, which included Black and Palestinian activists and artists, including Danny Glover, Lauryn Hill, Remy Kanazi, Rafif Ziadeh, kind of showing the parallels between what Blacks were experiencing here in the United States and what Palestinians experienced inside the occupied territories and Israel proper. There were delegations between Palestinians going to Ferguson, going to Standing Rock. There were black and brown activist delegations coming to Palestine that kind of reinforced and further highlighted the growing awareness of a lot of our commonalities between our struggles, and the repression that all of us were facing at the hands of the same type of state violence, prison industry, militarized policing, and white nationalist terrorism attacks that have impacted all of our communities. And that kind of brought us to this situation where Palestine was now seen as part of the social justice framework that exists in the United States. These factors have enabled us to do very strong work in the components of the B and the D of BDS, the boycott and divestment, whether it's church divestment actions, university resolutions, union resolutions, or actual divestment from companies that have, as a result, withdrawn from Palestine and Israel. We've had a lot of impact, and we can see the results, both in terms of the symbolic support, but also in terms of actually economic pressure on Israel. I believe has gotten us to the point where it's provided enough leverage and political pressure to begin to demand the yes. We're at a point right now where a call for a military arms embargo and sanctions against Israel is a possibility. This was not the case 10, 15 years ago. We look a little bit at some of the legislation that's being put forward. Betty McCollum's legislation that's been supported by several Congress people about promoting human rights for Palestinian children living under Israeli military occupation. It seemingly seems like a very small thing. Let's not support Palestinian children's imprisonment. Seems good, it seems very minimal, but it's having a lot of difficulty, as you can imagine. But it actually is a very strong legislation because it looks to make amends of a provision of the Foreign Assistance Act known as the Leahy Law to prohibit funding for the military detention of children in any country, including Israel. And that is the beginning of sanctions. And that is why this bill is being so vehemently attacked, and there's such large attempts to stop it. If we look at, although it's not a political party, but it's an important political organization, the Democratic Socialists of America, which was a group that, since its founding, was a place for liberals who supported Israel. It was the place for PEPs, Progressive Except on Palestine. In August 2017, it passed a resolution in support of the Palestinian BDS call almost unanimously. And it actually has grown in terms of its own political power with this action. And that's not to say that we're there. There's a lot of work to be done. Israel continues to escalate in its actions against Palestinians, Palestinian solidarity activists, and increasingly any entity. It doesn't just have to be Palestinian solidarity activists. It could be Israeli, Jewish, American, European, or anyone that dares to criticize Israel can come under attack. And of course, this was most recently exemplified by the two members of the US Congress, Ilhan, Omar, and Rashida Tlaib, at the behest of the US president, mind you, being denied entry into Palestine, Israel for their political views. More increasingly, American Jewish and non-Jewish, liberal and soft Zionists are finding it hard to swallow this slap in the face of this historic U.S.-Israeli relationship. There was something that was very exceptional about it and untouched. More are beginning to question the extent of their beliefs in this Israeli democracy. In the end, I feel like the upshot here is that there's a lot more work to be done organizing and participating in actions to stop the erasure of all civil, political, and economic rights that are being threatened by this new administration here in the United States, providing support and solidarity for our brothers and sisters in their struggles against the specific injustices that they are facing here in the U.S., while continuing to provide direct support and solidarity with Palestinians in their struggle for freedom, equality, and justice through targeted boycott and divestment campaigns, and beginning to leverage that political pressure towards calls for sanctions. Ultimately, we do understand that all of these struggles are one, and together we have the power to make real change, whether it be here in the United States or in Palestine. Thank you.
When I entered into NYU, I was a political science major. I was not an activist. I was pretty cookie cutter, looking to become a staffer in Congress or run a campaign, something like that. And I took a semester sponsored by NYU to intern in my congressman's office in DC. And my congressman is Eliot Engel. Maybe some of you in this room know him. Yep, Lower Westchester. Yeah, so I'm from New Rochelle, born and raised. So I took a semester in DC to intern for him. He's one of the most, if not the most, pro-Israel members of Congress. That's very much his role. I was not really aware of a lot of that when I went down there. I was 19 years old and I had never thought about Palestine. So I'm in the office, and as the interns are going through the mail, and I received an invitation to a briefing sponsored by JBP and a few other groups about the demolition of, I think, Susia in the West Bank. And nobody in my office had asked me to go. Nobody, which is a big role that the interns play, is going into these briefings and taking notes for what they see as relevant. And nobody in my office asked me to go to this. Nobody in my office was interested in this information, but it just looked interesting to me, and it looked important. I read that children were having their homes demolished, and that was horrifying to me. So I went to this briefing. Literally no other Congress members were there. The only other interns that were at this briefing had gone there on their own volition. A lot of them were Students for Justice in Palestine activists on their campuses. So that briefing was my big introduction to this movement. And I spoke to a rabbi from the Jewish Voice for Peace that was there, and we talked about my congressman and how my congressman had the power to stop these demolitions that we were talking about today. And we both kind of knew that he was never going to do that. It was really shocking to me, knowing that people have the power in their hands to affect real change. And so since then, I took a gap year in school to live over there. I lived in Jerusalem. I came back, formed a Jewish Voice for Peace chapter at NYU, and we decided that it was really important to us to try to pass a BDS resolution. In the 80s, our school actually passed a similar resolution, divesting from South African apartheid. So we thought, this is the only natural progression. We have to do this. We were gaining more and more members. I'm sure many of you have heard that more and more young Jews are rejecting the Jewish state in favor of a democratic solution. And I can see that on my campus. Like so many other Jews were, like myself, torn between going to the Jewish Student Center on campus, which of course receives funding from plenty of extremely right-wing Zionist funders, and having Israel and all of this pro-Israel politics really forced on you, and wanting to express our Jewish identity and go to Shabbat and do all the normal things that Jews do on campus. So that was the big impetus for forming JVP, is that I was starting to look around in my community and I saw a lot of other people that were feeling the same way as me. We wrote a resolution that was targeting companies that NYU was invested in, notably Caterpillar, Lockheed Martin, and Boeing. These all are the apparatus that Israel uses to conduct its war crimes and the occupation. These are the tools that they use. And so if we can get them out of Israel's hands, they can't sustain this. And so we wrote that resolution. We passed it in our student senate by a couple of votes. It was very contentious. We had a lot of opposition, a lot of astroturfy campaigns going around our campus of printouts of activists' faces, stickers getting put up. JBP is anti-Semitic. Myself and a lot of my other fellow students were placed on a blacklist online called Canary Mission. So it was very, very heated, but the whole time it really solidified all of the people on this campus that were in favor of peace. It really helped bring us together because we really built this amazing alliance from like the Black Student Union to the Slam Poetry Club to like Korean Students United. So many student like activities and groups and faculty were so excited to sign on, and that's how we got it passed. Like we couldn't have done it without the huge support on campus. And actually, after that resolution passed through the Student Senate, the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at NYU released their own statement saying that they were not going to sponsor a student to study abroad in Israel, and supporting our resolution as well, and encouraging other departments. So that was really exciting. This was 2018.
Oh, wow.
Thank you. Of course, it's a mostly symbolic move as far as the resolution goes, because the day after we passed it, the president of NYU said there's no way. He didn't say this part, but our shareholders have way too much at stake here, is the unfortunate reality. So that's kind of my big anecdote to share, is our successful BDS campaign. I'm really proud to be a part of this community and network of other campuses that have been passing these resolutions. And I'll say a little bit about the Deadly Exchange campaign, because that's a big campaign that the Jewish Voice for Peace has launched. And that is calling attention to the fact that police departments, many of the same that have been involved with shootings and brutality, get flown to Israel to train with the military there and the police there. And we call it the Deadly Exchange because that's exactly what it is. They are exchanging their tactics that they use on these conferences, but one of Israel's biggest money producers in their economy is arms. And so just as we give money to Israel, they kind of give it back to us by buying our arms, selling us their arms, and it's a whole big process of militarization. It's all, as you were saying, it's totally connected. Like literally the same tear gas is in their hands. So this is what the Deadly Exchange is targeting. There's a really great database called Palestine is Here, which will show you a map of the police departments around the country who have traveled to Israel to do these exchanges. And it's pretty astounding. There's dots all over the map. My community police department did it. You can see when they went on the trip, what they did, what their curriculum was, which is, of course, very biased. All of these trips are funded by not just Zionists, but extremely right-wing types like Sheldon Adelson, huge donors to Donald Trump. So, yeah, I think that's about everything I wanted to cover. I'm happy to answer any questions or clarify anything.
Are there any questions?
Two things. First, on NYU campus, is it having any real effect, like stocking the food in the student cafeteria? And secondly, didn't Governor Cuomo say something like he wasn't going to allow BDS in New York State or something? I don't know the details.
So the answer to that is no. Besides the social and cultural department no longer sponsoring students to study abroad in Israel, we have an actual program in Tel Aviv that is supposed to accept NYU students. Besides that, there has been no change because our administration is very, very reliant on the types of donors that would not agree with following through. To your question about Governor Cuomo saying something about BDS will not happen in New York State, I think I know what you're talking about. He said something like, if you boycott Israel, the state of New York will boycott you. I'm not sure what that means.
So I'm not sure if it was 2 or 3 years ago, he put out, they tried multiple times in the New York State legislation to pass an anti-BDS law. And every time everybody was saying, hello, free speech, Constitution, you can't do that, it's not allowed. So 2016, 17, I'm not sure of the year, he put out an executive order because they were getting nowhere with this anti-BDS law. And he said within 18 months, he's going to put a list of companies or organizations that are going to be blacklisted because of their boycott efforts. We got worried for about a minute. A year and a half passed, nothing came out. 2 years, I think, in, he put out a list, and it was like a Japanese company, something that nobody's invested in, something that's not really operating in. He had nothing of relevance. There was none of these Palestine solidarity organizations were on it, not any of the unions, not the academic associations. Nobody that had actually passed the resolution was actually listed because it's unconstitutional, and I think that they know that. They know that ultimately, even if these anti-BDS laws are being, not if they are being, I think it's in like 26 states at this point. But once they attempt to enact them, after a lot of heartache and money and effort and time, it's overturned because until now, boycott is protected under the First Amendment as free speech. Until now.
Who finances the police in our nation to be sent over to Israel to be educated?
I'm not sure of any exact names, and I'm not sure if this group finances it, but the Anti-Defamation League runs these trips. They are the ones that set the curriculum and bring them over. I'm not sure if the money is directly coming from the ADL or if they're just the ones facilitating it. Do you know of any?
I don't have specific answers, but I can imagine that part of it is probably U.S. tax dollars that's being used to spend on these trips because they're used as development and, developing the police force. As Jenny said earlier, Zionists, far-right billionaires like Adelson and others that want to maintain and support these kinds of growing things. But it's a very profitable exchange as well, because in the end, both end up buying each other's arms and weapons and using each other's strategies and tools and all of that.
What it does is it contacts people who have the money and arranges the financing to go directly from them.
In previous years, there have been primaries against Representative Engel by people who were trying to advocate a more neutral position on the Palestinian issue, or maybe even advocacy of that issue. When you were working in Representative Engel's office, he must have been receiving some kinds of letters about concerns about what the Israeli government was doing. How were those letters being answered? And did you ever speak to him about the position to take in the answers to those letters?
Quite frankly, I didn't receive a single letter that mentioned Palestine while I was there. I received a lot of postcards or emails that were the types that are mass copy and pasted and sent and replicated by people just writing their names on it. I received a lot of those from the ADL APAC types that were recruiting their constituents to write these letters. Because of organized efforts, we definitely received very, very pro-Israel types of letters. I think I wrote him a letter once that was urging him to not demolish something or another. And I remember receiving a letter back that just said the standard lines of supporting a democratic two-state solution. It was very dismissive.
Could you possibly tell me a little bit about the right of return? Would the refugees then be returning to the houses that I've heard were confiscated during El-Nakba? And then the natural follow-up question, where would the people who are living in those houses now go?
The right of return of refugees is internationally recognized right, globally. In particular, in terms of the right of refugees of Palestinians, is to return to their homes and properties, which would mean throughout the 1948 territories in Israel proper now. What happened in 1948 is, yes, Israel did establish communities in several major cities like Haifa and Jaffa, and displace people and live on their lands. But the majority of Palestinians were living in the villages around these cities and towns that were destroyed and left. So you would have things like what is now Canada Park, has a number of destroyed Palestinian villages on it that actually has no human inhabitants. It's a national park. So in terms of space and numbers, there is a capacity to be able to embrace Palestinians without removing the current population that's there. But as to if Palestinians will return, it is both a collective and an individual right. So collectively, nobody, I mean, a number of people make an issue out of Abu Mazen having given up the right of return to Safad. He can give up his individual right of return, but he can't give up the Palestinian people's right of return. So as individuals, Palestinians may say, I'm a refugee, but I'm actually living in the United States. I'm comfortable, I'm happy. I just need reparations, for having lost my home and properties, and that's what should be given. Another Palestinian might say, I'm in a refugee camp in Lebanon. I've been living under horrendous situation. I have no rights. I don't have a passport. I don't have the possibility of leaving my refugee camp. I want to return to my village, and they have to have the right to do that. So pragmatically, what would happen? Solutions can be carried out that would be ethical for embracing the rights of Palestinians and the rights that Israelis have since received or attributed because of their having now lived on this land for 70 years.
If anybody is curious to look up more resources to understand the right of return a little bit better, I'm sure there's a lot of places you could go, but I'll shout out an organization called Zochrot. It's Zochrot. And I know that their mentality is very much, we need to talk about the right of return as if it's going to concretely happen. So let's answer these questions that sound really hard. Because if we talk about it like it will happen, then that's the only way that we can make it happen. So they have a campaign called Return Vision that's all about what From the River to the Sea will look like with the right of return. So they're a great resource.
I had a question for each of you. The Palestinian lady, I wanted to know the number of Palestinians who've been displaced. I also wanted to know whether or not you think it's feasible under a two-state solution for this right of return to happen, because it seems like it would start a war, and Israel's already stolen a lot of property, and there are sort of already people settled on it. If there were one state, then the Palestinians would overwhelm the Israelis, and then that would probably push the other side into war, at least a segment of the population. So how could there be a peaceful solution to it? And the young lady, when they had the anti-apartheid against Mandela, against South Africa, there was a national student movement, and it took them years, but they did divest really big universities, rich ones, but it took years of visuals and stuff like that. So I wanted to know, do you feel that this is the kind of issue that could become a national student movement?
In terms of statistics on refugees, Palestinians as a whole number about 11 million. The vast majority of them are refugees, but these numbers are difficult to tell because there's 1.5 million in Gaza, of which 700,000 are displaced refugees. So there are some Palestinian refugees that are internally displaced people, and then there are refugees that are living in mainly the Arab countries around it. According to the United Nations, it's about 6.8 million, but these are not all people living outside of Palestine. Two-state solution is fine if it embraces those three demands that we talked about. Ending the occupation, which a two-state solution does, right? It would mean withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza Strip. If it's an ethical two-state solution, it would be withdrawal to the 1967 borders, which is not what's happening right now. At best, Palestinians have about 22% of the land, according to the Oslo Accord. So even if we were to get a two-state solution, according to Oslo, we would have 22% of historic Palestine. The two-state solution should be based off of the 45-55% partition plan. That's not going to happen. So already a two-state solution is out the window. But let's say we accept as Palestinians, we'll take just 22% of the land. We end the occupation in most of the populated areas of the West Bank. We don't have roads that connect us. We don't have most of the access to our land. We don't have any access to water. But let's say we take it. Fine. Does that mean the Palestinian citizens of Israel are given full equality? Does that mean that we end all of the discriminatory laws against them in terms of what they can study, where they can live, where they can purchase land, their housing rights, their marriage rights? A Palestinian in the West Bank loves a Palestinian in the 48 territories. They might even be relatives because Palestinians marry their relatives, but the Palestinian in the 48 territory in Israel can't live in the West Bank or they'll lose their citizenship. The Palestinian in the West Bank can't go to Israel because they're not being given citizenship. So their right to marry, their right to love. If there's a way to provide these rights to Palestinians, that's a second question in terms of the two-state solution. And yes, even in terms of a two-state solution, the demand for right of return is not going to go away. Right of return is not connected with a one-state or a two-state solution. Right of return is a penultimate demand of the Palestinian people. We could have 10 states. Individuals and as a group, as a collective, we have a right to return. Now, that might cause a war. A very real war is going on. It's just being enacted solely on Palestinian bodies. So it's Palestinians that are being put in jail, Palestinian homes that are being demolished, Palestinian children that are being killed. A war is taking place. It's just a war on Palestine. The question is how to end that, right? There's never been a taking of privilege from a group without some type of struggle. So it's not to say that we can promise you that it's going to be a peaceful resolution to this. We are demanding that privilege be taken away from one group and equally distributed to all so that there's some equality. That hurts. That doesn't happen easily. You know, the end of slavery did not end the United States. The end of apartheid did not end South Africa. So those are the models that we should be looking at in terms of becoming a more, not a democratic, but a more democratic, working towards democracy in an ethical way, as opposed to worrying about the loss that certain groups are going to have. There will be loss. There's no doubt about it.
Before I answer the question that was directed at me, I just wanted to say a little bit about this as well. The reality on the ground over there is that it already looks like a one state. There's almost 1 million Jewish Israelis, 30% of which are American, by the way. But there's almost 1 million Jewish Israelis living throughout the West Bank. You can go driving in the West Bank from top to bottom on a Jewish highway, and it looks just like Israel. Jewish people can drive in and out seamlessly. It already looks like one state, and that goes for the people there too. The people are interacting with each other, even the settlers and the Palestinians that live next door to them. If you've spent any time around any person that lives in the West Bank, they'll tell you that they all take their cars to the neighboring Palestinian villages to get their cars checked up because it's cheaper there. All of the Palestinians that live in nearby villages to the settlements work in the settlements. So their economy is one economy. They already live next to each other. The issue is that it's an apartheid system. So that's the only thing that needs to be changed. I know that two-state was very popular while I was growing up and a little bit before my time, but at this point, while I was over there, it really looked like a one-state is the only realistic thing that could happen, whether we like it or not. That's the direction it went in. In terms of this BDS movement being a campus-wide movement, it already is. Tons of universities, I don't know the exact number, but many, like dozens and dozens across the country have passed similar resolutions. Even more have tried to pass resolutions. I can only see it growing, so I'm excited about that.
Jenny, I'd like to address this to you. You said that you were there in Israel, in the West Bank, and that the settlers and the Palestinian people are living next door to each other, they're interacting and all that, but still it is an apartheid system. So there are two sets of laws, one for the Jewish and one for the Palestinians. Just a day or two ago, I read a very disquieting article about the confiscation of springs, Palestinian springs on private land, where the Palestinians cannot access the springs, they cannot access the water. Their olive groves are dying from lack of water. Their sheep herds are dying, and there's nothing they can do about it. RIHAN, is there anything that can be done? I know it's an international question, but Israel so far has gotten away with everything with impunity.
The question was just in regards to the relationships between Palestinians and in the West Bank and Israeli Jewish settlers that are in the West Bank. The relationships that Jenny talked about in terms of them, using each other's resources and interacting. So the other part of that is, what about Palestinians' loss of water resources? So their springs, they've lost access to their springs as a result of a lot of these settlements being built on private Palestinian land. I understand what Jenny is saying, and it is true in certain areas. Many Palestinians work in settlements. They're actually, the unbelievably sad reality is that in order to survive, they're building the settlements on their land that's been confiscated. And that's the reality of Palestinians, because there's total economic devastation within the Palestinian economy. Palestinians go to shop in Israeli settlement supermarkets because it's cheaper than what they can get in Ramallah, because Ramallah has to pay a double tax on all its products, for example. But at the same time, you have situations in Hebron where Palestinians are constantly being targeted by the settlers that are there. You have situations in large parts of the north of the West Bank, in Qalqilia and Jenin, where things like wild hogs are put out in Palestinian pastures, making it unclean for them to get the produce that they plant. You have situations where Palestinian agriculture has totally been shut down. Recently, a few years ago, farmers started making mushrooms. They found a good way to cultivate Palestinian mushrooms. Palestinian mushrooms were in the market. I was so happy to see them. A few years ago, I found only Palestinian mushrooms in the market. Well, it hit the Israeli mushroom industry, I guess, impacted on it because people were buying the Palestinian because it was better, which is not often the case. So Israel stopped allowing the fertilizer, the certain seed or the fertilizer that the Palestinians needed. They stopped allowing it to come through the border. So the attacks on every component of Palestinian economy, every component of agriculture is vast, and the struggle over water is the peak of it. So if anybody looks at the route of the apartheid wall, you'll see that it sometimes goes very much deep into Palestinian West Bank territory that should have been under Oslo, whatever, part of the ultimate Palestinian state. Some of it is because of population grabs, so like land grabs, but a lot of it follows the aquifers that exists in the West Bank that not only Palestinians in the West Bank depend on, but Palestinians in Gaza depend on. So Israel has kind of built the wall on areas where the aquifers and the springs fall on the Israeli side of the wall. It is a major issue. We buy water. Palestinians have to buy water from Israel. And it's our water resource, even if technically you abide by the two-state solution. Yeah, the reality on the ground is that there are areas where Palestinians are interdependent with settlers, and that's their reality. But there are a lot of situations where Palestinians are being openly attacked by settlers, and Israel definitely has confiscated the large amount of land and water resources that would make any Palestinian state impossible to be economically viable.
And I'll share just a little bit of a tidbit on this subject as well. As far as settlers attacking Palestinians, which is a daily reality, especially in agricultural terms, if this were a normal country that treated all of the people that it controlled with respect, then there would be legal recourse for situations like this, right? Like, you can't just go to someone's land and burn down all their olive trees. An example of what happens in the West Bank between a Jewish settler and a Palestinian, a little bit of an ironic thing is that Israel knows that they're occupying the West Bank, and they apply international law very sparingly when it benefits them. And so one little clause that they've taken to, there's rules for occupying a nation. There's international humanitarian law about it. And it's supposed to be temporary, and when you are temporarily occupying another nation, you're not allowed to extend civilian resources to them because that would be absorbing the population by force, which is a war crime. So when it comes to extending any sort of civilian types of resources, even like garbage collection, much less a police force, Israel does not provide that to the Palestinians. And when there's an issue, while a Jewish settler will talk to the Israeli police, the Palestinian involved can only be handled by the Israeli military, according to Israel. So if something happens to a Jewish settler, he goes through the Israeli legal system. A Palestinian that lives 500 feet away would be taken by the military and go through military court, which has a 99% conviction rate. So that is literally two different legal systems for one group of people.
I have really two questions. The first one pertains to two possible impediments to the right of return. The first impediment, I believe, is that in the time when Israel started, 1947-48, I believe that the Palestinians didn't have paper deeds and stuff like that to their property, and therefore it would be very contentious, I believe, for people to establish that they or their ancestors lived there. That's the first impediment. The second impediment, and then I specifically would like this lady to answer it, even if this lady does or doesn't, and that is, are you concerned about the demographics? In other words, that's one of the things that I hear Israelis complain about, that they want to keep it as an Israeli or Jewish state, so to speak. And people are concerned that if you had a lot of Arabs, presumably predominantly Muslims, coming in, then it would cease to be a Jewish state. And the second question I want to ask, do you speak Arabic? Yes. Okay, that's a question for you predominantly. I want to know, you mentioned going to Palestine and you talked about Palestinians. I'd like to know if Arabic-speaking people can distinguish between who's a Palestinian, who's a Syrian, who's a Jordanese, or whatever you call them, and who is a Saudi Arabian. Do the people have different accents? Do they dress differently, look differently? Can you tell who a Palestinian is by identifying them, so to speak? That's my second question.
In terms of Palestine, prior to the British-French colonization of that whole territory, Palestinians, Jordanians, Lebanese, Syrians considered themselves all part of Greater Syria. The music, the food was very, very similar. But that's not to say it was the same. It would be much like saying to somebody from Mexico, can you distinguish yourself from Guatemala or Peru or, Brazil or Argentina. There's similarities in the language, there's similarities in the culture, there's similarities in the food, but each one has different associations, relationships, and mainly it was a tribal society. So I know what my larger tribe is. I know who my relationships are, and I know the villages that I came from. In terms of Palestinians having deeds to the land, a lot of Palestinians do still have their keys to their homes. So Palestinians have held on to that. People know which villages they're from. So when you go to Lebanon, they will tell you, I am from this village that's 20 miles east of Haifa. The other families that were part of this village are XYZ, right? So it's known that they've been displaced from these areas. I don't know that it's right to try to take away their rights because of a current ideology that may not have existed at that time, that everybody had a deed to their land. But I would say a large number of Palestinians do have deeds with their lands. And what's interesting is probably the best archive for it is in the Hebrew University, because the Hebrew University was one of the first institutions that was established, and they kept meticulous records, including a lot of family, I guess what you would call family Bibles or diaries here, that showed which families were part of which areas and so on. So there's ways to solve that pragmatic issue and not take away justice from the equation in terms of dealing with that. I remember those two parts of the question. I don't know if there was something else.
The other part was about the demographic, the threat to Israel as a Jewish country.
Just to address that, I want us to just think for a second if we said we really need to close off the borders of the United States from any more Muslims because we really want to maintain this as a Christian Judeo country. If anybody finds that acceptable, we can talk about the demographic situation in Palestine. But if that's not an acceptable sentence to you in terms of the United States, where Arabs and Muslims are not indigenous to this place, where we would be immigrants, then it shouldn't be acceptable to a land that they are indigenous to.
I will say a little bit about the history before the State of Israel was created. Jews have always been there. They've always been a minority. They've consistently for hundreds of years made up around at least like 5% of the population there. And they lived pretty peacefully from what we can tell. And there's been plenty of Jewish communities from the Middle East that lived very peacefully with their Arab neighbors. So there's no reason to think that this can't happen, that Jews being a minority somewhere is inherently a sign of something to be scared about. I mean, I'm a minority here in the US, and this country has been really kind to my family. The only thing that I'm
Well, scary for all of us, right?
Right, exactly. The only thing that I'm a little bit concerned about is actually the Israeli public, honestly, because there's really not much of a left in that society. Like it's quite a right-wing society. That's the honest truth. I have many people that I love that are part of Israeli society that are Jewish Israelis. They're exceptions to the rule. The society, the Israeli public has rejected like any idea that they want to be in peace with Palestinians, at least on paper. That's a challenge, but I think it's a challenge worth overcoming. I think that if people look inwards enough, they know it's not that much of a challenge. They already, in many cities, live next to Palestinians. Clearly they have before. So it's not a concern for me that Jews are, being a minority is inherently this scary thing. I mean, the thing about that area of Palestine, historically, it is so diverse. There's so many minorities that have called that place home, that have been a part of it. So I don't think that being a minority is necessarily something to be terrified of, especially in a democratic state.
It's very good to know that the progressive movement in this country is learning to appreciate and support the Palestinian cause. I wonder, despite the last thing Julie said, whether there's much fraternization or much activity between Jews and Palestinians, or Israelis and the Palestinians around various issues, and whether that reality is also a basis for some hope.
You mentioned the congresswomen, etc. I was wondering, and RIHAN went over the history from Ferguson and developing partnerships and alliances and etc. Well, within that mix, anti-Semitism comes in as a powerful weapon to decimate particularly people of color organizations. And we saw what happened with Black Lives Matter, with Tamika Mallory. All these people were delegitimized. Black Lives Matter fell apart. The assault and the ongoing assault is huge, right? And yet we have survived and are growing. So I'm wondering if you would want to comment on how much, I know 2 years ago in JVP we were like fretting over how are we going to stand up for the Women's March leadership? How are we going to stand up for Black Lives Matter against the Jewish establishment and really try and mediate and have people's backs and stuff like that? We went over that quite a bit. And I was just wondering, in your experience, and how you would assess it right now, because it's all happening at once in a powerful way. Both the taking on of a critique of Israel is growing and deepening, and the assault of accusations of anti-Semitism are growing and deepening. So just wondering, in the practice, since we're activists, a lot of us here, thinking this is something for us to take on.
Just part of a commentary, if you just drive through the West Bank, you'll see villages with black tanks on the roof, their water tanks, and those without. The difference is that with the water tanks on top, they're Palestinian. They get water once a week to fill those tanks. And when the soldiers feel nasty, they just shoot them up so they don't hold the water. Settlements have 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, water. The other question about fraternalizing between Palestinians and Israelis, it's against the law now for an Israeli to go to the West Bank. They can't even have a chance to see what's going on.
Thank you very much. My question is about solutions. You may have talked about this before I got here. I'm very familiar with the story of Rachel Corrie and how important it was for her to stand up for the Palestinians. A play has even been written. I'm sure you know about her life. What can any of us do that would be effective to bring justice and help to the plight of the Palestinians today?
That's a good question to end on, I think. So, you can.
Get all the questions.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, you can decide what to address.
Okay. Yeah, so there was some talk about the relationship between Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. And the unfortunate reality is that right now they are more segregated than ever from each other. And I think that is actually part of the reason why so many Israelis are so afraid of what it would mean to share a country with Palestinians. It's because they don't have relationships with Palestinians in Israel proper. I mean, my boyfriend who I live with is a Jewish Israeli, and he grew up going to an all-Jewish school. He didn't know a single Palestinian, even though he lived next to a Bedouin village. Versus his parents' experience, they lived before the apartheid wall went up, before some of the intense militarization had set in, and they remember interacting with Palestinians, and they seem not nearly as fearful as like my generation in Israel does. And I think I think it's directly because of how separated they are from each other. And that's part of the reason why I am in favor of a democratic solution, because I can only see the way that gets better is by interacting with one another and getting to know each other.
Just in addition to that, I think the one area where Palestinians and Jews have been effectively able to work together is any type of anti-Zionist organizing, whether it be for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. There's a great organization called Boycott from Within that's made up of Palestinian and Israeli citizens living in the 48 territories that's actually doing very courageous work, because there is anti-BDS laws in Israel. There are people, when my uncle was held under administrative detention, which entails being held in jail without charge or trial. So you're just held for 6-month periods that are continuously extended. We had a very strong committee that was made up of Palestinians and Israelis, Israeli Jews and Israeli Palestinians, kind of lobbying to get him released and to get all administrative detainees released. So there are areas where we can work together, but it has to be in this kind of place where we are confronting the political regime and its violations of Palestinian human rights ultimately. And so that, for me, that gives me hope. The fact that I know that there are Israelis like that. They're not many, but they exist, and their ability to continue working as Israel becomes so much more far right is doubly impressive to me. And I see them as brothers and sisters in our struggle. In terms of standing up for those that are being attacked, it's a huge problem. The only positive component of it is there are more and more of us being attacked, right? So when U.S. congresswomen and students and academics and intellectuals and artists and everybody, street perform, like everybody and anybody. It's not just Palestinians that are being attacked anymore. It's not just Palestinian solidarity activists that are being attacked anymore. It's anybody that's really standing up that says, well, boycott is there's a right to boycott. You can't say it and then you become anti-Semitic as a result of that. It begins to show how horribly atrocious the utilization of that as a weapon and a tool to silence criticism of Israel, how hypocritical it is to do that, as we are witnessing real anti-Semitic attacks against synagogues and against Jewish people in the United States. I think just continuing to present that hypocrisy and address it and kind of be very, very vocal about it. I don't think we would have gotten as far as we did if it wasn't for really ethical Jewish organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace that are kind of standing up and saying this is not what anti-Semitism is, and we are a part of this struggle. It's a problem, and I think that it's just standing in solidarity. I'm very happy with the work that Palestine Legal is doing around this, trying to kind of provide direct support for Palestinian and Palestinian solidarity activists that are losing their jobs or not being allowed to form committees or organizations. And we have gotten some wins. And that's what should be a little bit heartening, because really it's an attempt to silence us. And the only thing that we can do is refuse to be quiet. That's really what ultimately I think is going to have us be able to win. And that's what we can do also to bring about justice for Palestinians. It's being active. It's being active in our communities. It's speaking up in our churches. It's speaking up in whatever situation that we are in. It might be something as simple as going to a local grocery store and saying, Sabra hummus is Israeli. I really don't want to buy Israeli goods. I really think you should stop shelving that. To creating some kind of, group organization, to being vocal about that activism so that other people can also feel comfortable about being active, because that's the strength of, our strength comes in numbers, and our strength comes in just being ethical and presenting it. Joining campaigns like the Deadly Exchange Program, the campaign by Jewish Voice for Peace. Code Pink has a campaign against Airbnb. There's a number of organizations that are carrying out campaigns. And if there's ever a time where Peace Action Manhattan says, well, we want to start thinking about what's a campaign that we can do locally, ADALAH-New York would be more than happy, and Jewish Voice for Peace, to come and brainstorm campaigns. I know we did a few actions with Peace Action Manhattan in terms of free olives for a free Palestine, where we went to Inwood Market, right? And then we went to Fairway or something. So we went to two different places and just kind of promoted the boycott of Israeli goods, a general kind of action. We had amazing, really good discussions with people around these issues. So I think that it's being active. I think it's finding some kind of campaign to work around, and then being very, very vocal and open about your support and your solidarity.
In terms of what we can do to support a free Palestine and Palestinians, BDS, that's the whole point, is that Palestinians have made it really easy for us and told us exactly what we can do to help. So really following their lead is, like, for me as a Jewish American, I found that to be the most helpful way to help, or at least the most obvious, the most accessible. It's really amazing how accessible, like, the boycott is. You can apply it in so many different ways and organize in your own community in so many different ways. And all the resources are there for us. Palestinians have told us exactly who is perpetrating violence and what we can do to stop it.
I think we owe you.